Again, I'm assuming that murdering people is bad. If you disagree with that, then you can disagree with the whole argument.
Let's not pretend what these countries were. Russia was an absolutist monarchy.
It is about time to face the fact that there is something very, very wrong in the way physics treats time.
It's not that there's nothing missing. It's not that we're done in any sense. But if there is anything missing, which there almost certainly is, if there are new laws of physics, new fields and particles we haven't yet discovered, they don't affect our everyday lives.
I served in Iraq, lived in Afghanistan, and saw these completely humiliating, horrifying messes.
A new kind of marketplace that trades exclusively, just zoom out a little bit, trades exclusively in human futures.
I'm fine with people who want to do these great, grand things that Aristotle would not have called metaphysics, but they do. Go ahead, be my guest. But I'm really interested in making actual progress.
String theory, for instance, I always regard it as hideous. It's not beautiful at all. It's the mathematics involved is elegant in many places. But when you think of it as a physical theory, you're combining the thing, you've got these extra dimensions, some of them are tiny, some of them are huge.
So if I ask you what caused the sinking of the Titanic, you give me different answers according to what is relevant to you. It was the hitting the iceberg, the fact that Britain was competing with America.
We just don't know what the gravitational pull of an electron is. So it's a really simple question, like what's going on with the gravitational field of this electron, and we don't know.
I start from the premise that killing people is bad and killing more people is worse than killing fewer people. So even though I also don't support terrorism, terrorists have killed a tiny number of people. The worst terrorist attack in history, 9/11, killed 3,000. Typical terrorist attack kills a handful. Whereas wars and revolutions kill people by the millions and tens of millions. And often it is true, Tariq listed a number of violent events in human history. We do not make the argument that these are good or justifiable. These were history's disasters. Now, I do believe that there are arguments that there can be occasions in which violence is justified if it is the only way to prevent greater violence. Again, I'm assuming that murdering people is bad. If you disagree with that, then you can disagree with the whole argument. And that murdering 2 million people, 4 million people, 20 million people is really, really bad. Now, did the events that we just heard result in the reduction of violence, prevention of killing of even greater numbers, which I suppose could be used as a utilitarian argument justifying violence? The answer is in virtually all the cases, no. The French Revolution was a disaster, killed 2 million people, led to the rise of Napoleon, perhaps the world's first totalitarian fascist dictator who began wars of conquest that killed an additional 4 million people, led to the restoration of slavery, to the restoration of the monarchy and a delay of democracy in France by perhaps a century. Russian Revolution killed several million, led to the Russian Civil War, which killed another 9 million, led to the rise of Stalin, who killed 20 million. There's an old cliche, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. Well, it ignores the fact that people aren't eggs, and that generally it does not result in an omelet. Again, the Chinese Revolution, perhaps the most disastrous event in history, led to the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, which killed perhaps 30 to 40 million people altogether. Time and again, violent revolution, violent war, in addition to the moral harm of mass murder, and again, I mean, murder, we're talking about millions or tens of millions of people, does not result in a stable, peaceful state that saves the lives of even more. Quite the contrary. A recent study by Maria Stephan and Erica Chenoweth actually looked over the last century at violent and nonviolent resistance movements to put the Gandhian hypothesis to a test that there are ways of overcoming tyranny using all of the tactics that Gandhi worked out. Now, you could, of course, be cynical about the Gandhian hypothesis by saying, well, he tugged at the heartstrings of the British at an opportune moment, and he just got lucky. So they decided to count. All of the resistance movements of the 20th century, they divided them into violent ones and nonviolent ones, putting aside the question of which was more moral, that is, which murdered fewer people, just asked the question of which is more effective. Now, it's not the case that violent resistance movements always succeed or that nonviolent ones fail or vice versa. But if you count them up, so they found that nonviolent resistance movements were 3 times as effective as violent ones.
Gandhi was never a dogmatic believer in nonviolence. When it served his needs, he came out and supported violence. He supported the British during the First World War, was active as a recruiting sergeant for people to join the Indian Army to go and fight for the British. He supported the Indian military intervention in Kashmir immediately after partition. So, there's the early Gandhi and the late Gandhi. The only cases where he was a firm believer in nonviolence was in the independence struggle against the British, because both he and Nehru, to a large extent, Indian leaders, freedom leaders, believed that the British could be negotiated out of India. And you didn't need violence, whereas the third leader, Subhash Chandra Bose, who was also very popular, believed the opposite. So I think Gandhi's nonviolence, which too much has been made of it, was largely tactical, based on his assessment of the colonial power that he was fighting.
There is a justification for just war in particular cases where the measured use of violence results in greater saving of lives and greater human flourishing than abjuring violence. And perhaps the battle against ISIS is one, perhaps the Second World War opposition to Hitler is another. But those are fairly circumscribed cases, and the vast majority of uses of violence, and most of the ones that we've heard today, don't fall into that category. They not only did they create harm in the infliction of violence themselves, but their aftermath was even greater brutality and violence. I think using the Russian Revolution as an example of why violence is justified is patently absurd. It led to even greater violence and oppression and some of the worst atrocities in human history.
Let's not pretend what these countries were. Russia was an absolutist monarchy. Tsarist rule was not particularly pleasant for the people prior to the Russian Revolution. Large numbers of serfs were treated no better than slaves, despite the Emancipation Declaration. So the logical conclusion of many of the arguments against the revolution implied that somehow what existed before was better. Putin says the same thing, by the way. That's the official line now, the worship of czars and Tsarism and the Orthodox Church, who carried out more pogroms in Europe prior to Hitler than any other regime in history. I mean, that's where pogroms grew and were invented, on a mass scale. So let's not forget that. Let's not forget all the attempts that were made to reform these regimes. By women. I mean, prior to the Lenin and the Bolsheviks, you had a huge anarchist current led largely by women. Some of the attacks which killed the Tsar, which killed the chiefs of police, were actually acts carried out by women. For what? For freedom.
But there's a sort of more interesting problem which people focus on much less. The number of old Etonians in Parliament is far too many from the size of the population, but I think it's something like 12 people out of 650. The more interesting thing is that in 1980, there were over 100 members of Parliament from blue-collar manual labour backgrounds. And not just in the Labour Party, in the Conservative Party as well, and they have almost entirely disappeared. Parliament has become very professionalised, very dominated by people who've been local councillors, who've worked as special advisors, who've worked as ministerial aides, many of whom have started volunteering for the party in their late teens, early 20s. So I think one of the big changes is not so much about the kind of the dozen or so kind of iconic Etonians, it's a sense that Parliament is becoming much, much more middle class and much more out of touch with people who've had ordinary jobs. Yeah.
So let's move on to power and the pursuit of power. Now, you changed direction several times before you decided to try to become an MP. Why did you? I mean, you had some rather interesting jobs, one might think. You clearly loved running the NGO in Afghanistan. You felt you were really doing some good. You could see the effects of what you were doing, which is a rare thing in life. And yet you left each of those occupations, jobs, finally to try to make a bid for political power in Britain. Why that progression? What was wrong with the jobs you were doing, if you like? Or was it just, were you being pushed out of them or pulled towards something else? I don't mean pushed out in the sense that someone else, but, by your ambition.
I think that one of the defining things for me was Iraq and Afghanistan. So I served in Iraq, lived in Afghanistan, and saw these completely humiliating, horrifying messes. So, and they really were beyond imagining horrifying. I mean, we were in a situation in which it was immediately obvious to me, once I hit the ground in Iraq, within about 2 or 3 weeks, that this was an impossible situation, that the international community didn't know what it was doing, was pretty impotent, was very, very unpopular, had no legitimacy, that basically Iraqis and Afghans did not want us there, particularly didn't want 100,000 troops in rural areas. And that should have been pretty obvious, that this was a sort of repeat of things we'd seen before. This was a repeat of the Vietnam War, right? Should have been incredibly obvious, but the truth was it wasn't. And I spent 7, 8 years feeling increasingly marginalized and crazy, trying to say within government that this is a real mess. And I was very lucky. I was relatively senior. I was able to meet all these big generals. I was able to brief Gordon Brown. I was able to do all this stuff. But I was making absolutely no difference. Hilary Clinton would sit me next to her at dinner when she was Secretary of State. I would spend an hour and a half trying to explain that things weren't working. And the only response you get is people would deploy ever more troops, ever more money. And we ended up spending $3.5 trillion, the US and its allies, in Iraq and Afghanistan, deploying 150,000 troops in each place. And of course, there is no bleaker, more obvious way of illustrating what went wrong than the fact that we went in at the end of 2001 to get rid of a Taliban government, spent 20 years, had an enormous number of Afghans killed, large numbers of US and British soldiers killed, and at the end of the 20-year period, simply handed the whole country back to the Taliban again. So for me, the journey to be a politician was driven by my frustration at being unable to change anything. I thought, in the end, these decisions are made by these people called politicians. If I can become a politician, that is the only way of convincing senior diplomats, senior generals, that what we're doing is completely mad. And I sensed that Iraq and Afghanistan were just an example of a much bigger problem. There was something in our mindset which probably meant we were doing similar things domestically, similar things at home, that the same idea that we were able to impose a template, a kind of central theory on areas that we didn't understand, that there was a gap between the rhetoric and reality, was probably a kind of deep sickness in the culture of the 90s and 2000s. So politics for me was fundamentally about change. It was about, a belief that I could change things.
Surveillance capitalism, like other eras of capitalism, claims something that lives outside the marketplace, claims it for the market dynamic, brings it into the market dynamic so it can be a commodity that can be sold and purchased. So famously, industrial capitalism claimed nature for the market dynamic so that it could be reborn as land and real estate, something that could be sold and purchased. A century and a half later, it produced climate crisis. We didn't know that was going to happen, but now we're paying the price. Surveillance capitalism follows in this pattern, but with a dark and unexpected twist. looking for the last unclaimed territory. It claims private human experience for the market dynamic. Unilaterally claims our experience as its free source of raw material for translation into data, which then feeds its supply chains. The data conveyed to its new factories that we call AI, artificial intelligence. Out of those new factories come products. But in this case, its products are predictions of human behavior. A leaked memo about Facebook's AI hub reveals that in its factory, it now ingests trillions of data points every day in order to produce, Facebook's language, not mine, 6 million predictions of human behavior per second. Those predictions are packaged and sold, not to us. They're about us, but they're not for us. They're sold to business customers in a new kind of marketplace that trades exclusively, just zoom out a little bit, trades exclusively in human futures. What we will do soon and later. Businesses have a keen interest in this. This began with online targeted advertising and the click-through rate being that first global prediction product. This has now traveled through the normal economy. We find it in every domain.
It is about time to face the fact that there is something very, very wrong in the way physics treats time. Physics has achieved great advances, especially in the special and general theories of relativity, revealing new aspects of time. But here is one aspect of time that physics is ignoring and actually trying to sweep under the rug. The most salient feature of time is that it is moving. There is some flow, there is some motion. We have all been in our beds this morning, early this morning. We are here now. We shall be back to beds, hopefully, late at night. There is something called the now which moves from one moment to the other. This is what everybody feels. What physics tells us, and it has, I'm a physicist, physics has very good arguments in favor of this, that this is wrong. Physics says the following: we are now in London, there is Jerusalem, there is Mexico City, they all coexist in space. And what physics wants us to believe, and they have good reason for that, is that all moments in time also coexist within the four-dimensional space-time. This is a very powerful picture, and it has a lot of truth in it. However, the most important aspect of time, and that is its flow, is being constantly denied by physics. They say that it leads to all kinds of paradoxes. I think that we should not be afraid of them, because we all know that there are other problems in physics. We don't understand quantum mechanics yet. There are several paradoxes. We don't understand several things about how the universe began. We don't understand even the issues like the error of time. There are enough issues in the existing theory which should encourage us to doubt it and look for a better picture.
So 2012 put the finishing touches on this picture that we now call the standard model of particle physics. Now, what I want to claim, you don't have to believe me, right? I mean, I'm going to say things that I think are true, and honestly, you should believe me, but you don't have to. There's no normative force that you have to, but you should understand what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, there's plenty that we don't know about the laws of physics, but there's something that we do know. There is a regime, an area of possible applications where we do understand the laws of physics. And that regime, that domain of validity for the laws as we currently understand them, includes everything going on in this tent. Everything going on in this tent, and for that matter, everything you've ever seen with your eyes, heard with your ears, touched with your fingers in your life, we understand the laws of physics that govern what those things are. This is what we call the core theory in physics. It's the standard model of particle physics plus Einstein's general relativity. You may have heard that gravity, which general relativity describes, does not play well with quantum mechanics. We don't have a quantum theory of gravity, and that's true, but we have a pretty good quantum theory of gravity. What we don't have is the final quantum theory of gravity. We can't explain the Big Bang or black holes, but if you want to explain why raindrops fall down rather than up, you can explain that in both quantum and gravitational terms right now. So everything that you've ever seen or touched, we have a theory that explains that. Of course, we don't understand dark matter, dark energy, the origin of the universe, and we certainly don't understand how these individual bits and pieces come together to make things like chemicals or aardvarks or financial systems and so forth, okay? Complex phenomena that are beyond the laws of fundamental physics. We certainly have a lot to do in understanding them, but whatever that work will eventually be, it better be compatible with the fundamental laws of physics. I don't understand how the human brain works in any great detail, but I know the brain is made of atoms. So if I'm going to come up with a theory of how the brain works, it better be compatible with the known laws of physics. Now, I know what you're thinking. I would only believe it if they showed me the underlying equations. You've come to the right place. Here you go. The good news is it's only one equation, okay? In Isaac Newton's time, it was F equals ma, Newton's second law, force is mass times acceleration. If you were Laplace's demon in a classical world, so someone gave you the billiard balls, the laws of physics you would have in your brain were Newton's laws, and you would know how the billiard balls bumped into each other. If you are a modern quantum mechanical Laplace's demon using the core theory to do your predictions, this is the equation you would use. And basically, this is the equation that plays the role of Newton's second law. This is the answer to the question, if you give me the state of the universe now, what will it be a moment from now? What would I predict would come next? Now, that's not remarkable. I mean, this is remarkable. This is an enormous amount of effort that goes into this one little tiny expression right here. The remarkable thing is that I'm saying that it's not that there's nothing missing. It's not that we're done in any sense. But if there is anything missing, which there almost certainly is, if there are new laws of physics, new fields and particles we haven't yet discovered, they don't affect our everyday lives. They don't affect what is happening in this room right now. There's dark matter, for example. Very probably there are dark matter particles streaming through this room. When I say very probably, that's because these dark matter particles must be very, very hard to detect. Otherwise, we would have detected them by now. We've been looking for them. Any new kind of stuff that is not subsumed in this equation is hard to detect and therefore can't have an enormous impact on what is going on in our bodies, in our brains, in the floor, in the rain, etc. So let me give you a tiny little argument in favor of that grandiose claim. The grandiose claim is the laws of physics underlying everyday life are completely understood.
We know of 4 different fundamental forces in physics. That's the electromagnetic force that most of you have probably heard of. Then we have the strong and weak nuclear force, and we have gravity. And the problem is that 3 of those forces, the electromagnetic and the 2 nuclear forces, have quantum properties. So we have some particles like electrons and quarks and gluons, stuff like this. And we know that they do funny things, like they obey the uncertainty principle, they can be in 2 places at the same time, that kind of weird stuff. And then there's gravity, which is described by Einstein's theory of general relativity, and that theory doesn't know anything about quantum properties. And this brings up the question, if I have a particle like an electron that can be in 2 places at the same time, and it has a mass, and that mass generates a gravitational pull, where does the gravitational pull go? You'd expect that to also go to 2 places at the same time, but Einstein's theory can't make that work, because it doesn't know anything about quantum properties. So this leaves us in this weird position where we just don't know what the gravitational pull of an electron is. So it's a really simple question, like what's going on with the gravitational field of this electron, and we don't know. And if you ask like more technically, what's the matter? It's just that those 2 theories, the quantum field theories that we use to describe particles, like the electron and a couple of other particles, Einstein's theory of general relativity, they're just mathematically incompatible. If we just put them together, it doesn't work. But nature knows how it works. So there's got to be a solution to this. And we don't know what it is. There have been many people who've tried to solve this problem. What we need is a theory of quantum gravity, so a theory that gives properties to gravity. At least that's the way that it's normally put. But more generally, we need some way to resolve this discrepancy between the two theories. And the probably best known approach to this is string theory that most of you will have heard of. There are other ideas like loop quantum gravity, and then there are less well-known ones like maybe asymptotically safe gravity and stuff like this. But so far, we don't know if any of those is correct or how we can even test them. And yes, I think it's a really big problem. Now, when it comes to my personal opinion on what to do, as I just said, like, people have worked on this problem for a long time. It's been known since the 1930s or something, so it's definitely not a new thing. And there are lots of smart people have spent their whole life trying to fix something that they think is wrong with gravity. And I have a lot of respect for all those people, and if they couldn't make it work, I'm pretty sure I can't make it work either. So this is why I think it's a better strategy to try and figure out if not there's something wrong with the quantum side of things, that the problems may be caused by us not understanding what quantization means in the first place.
The positive in the New Age spiritualities is that they do represent that people are seeking places in which they can practice in a way that'll bring them transformations so that they have a proper home for something like the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. But as I said, this is often confused with sort of an arcane or esoteric knowledge project. It's often confused with sort of weird subcultural political commitments. So I think there's a lot of confusion in this confused phenomena. So I would say that my overall position is the New Age movement is a symptom of much deeper, profounder confusions that if we don't address, things are going to get much worse in general for us as a culture. Even in our attempts to give very sort of matter-of-fact explanations, we face these issues of relevance. So if I ask you what caused the sinking of the Titanic, you give me different answers according to what is relevant to you. It was the hitting the iceberg, the fact that Britain was competing with America, the fact that the British steel had impurities and in that cold water. And what you end up doing, and this is a philosophy of science thing, you end up saying, you know what caused any event? The entire previous history of the universe, which doesn't explain anything.
Yeah.
So all of our explanations are choices of relevance, of intelligibility. And then I would say to Michael, I think philosophical questions like why is there something rather than nothing, yes, they have been interpreted as sort of causal questions, but they can also be interpreted as ontological questions, right? Which is a question like, well, what is the relationship between the intelligibility of things and the reality of things? And this is a way in which, you know, some philosophers like Heidegger wrestled with this question about why is there something rather than nothing. He wasn't concerned about what's the origin. He was concerned with how is it that meaning and being fit together so that we can live the kinds of life we live. And I think those questions are properly philosophical in that the answers to those questions are presupposed by science. Science presupposes intelligibility. It presupposes that we can find relevance. It presupposes that we make judgments of significance. So there's two threats to that. There's ignorance, we don't know, and that's knowledge addresses that, and we gather evidence for our knowledge. But there's also foolishness. There's ways in which the fact that we have to pick out what's relevant and significant, which always means we're ignoring that while we're looking at, this is how you get all the framing effects, right? You get framing effects and you get confirmation bias, right? These are all, every bias is actually a heuristic. That's what the no free lunch theorem is basically showing. What I'm saying is right? People are always prone to self-deception in which that relationship of connectedness to the environment can be severed, can be undermined, can be warped and twisted. And so they need ways of intervening below just their beliefs. They need skills, they need traits of character, they need ways of connecting with other people. You take a standard reasoning test that everybody reliably fails on, like the Wason selection test, 10% success rate, robustly replicates. You replace it with 4 people who are allowed to talk to each other, and the success rate goes from 10% to 80%. There's something going on there, right? And there's a lot of machinery that's going on that is not about knowledge overcoming ignorance, it's about wisdom overcoming foolishness.
I don't think that our overall accounts will ever provide us with an accurate description of sort of what's out there. So while I would encourage the idea that we should put forward an overall metaphysical account, I think we have to give up the idea that that metaphysical account might be true. And that's because I think that our theories and accounts of the world are tools to help us intervene. I don't think they're a description of some ultimate reality.
Now, philosophers, especially in what we may call the TikTok era of metaphysics, have become really enamored of giving a very deep meaning to metaphysics. And quite honestly, I find it sort of a waste of time. I mean, there the physicists are looking for new forces, looking for new particles. And there's Hilary saying, well, you're never going to really kill the truth, you know. And they say, yeah, I know, but we're making progress. And there are the neuroscientists who are discovering things about consciousness. And there's Hilary saying, yeah, you're never really going to know what the nature of our purpose is. And they say, yeah, but I know these people are in pain and we're trying to help them. And so I'm fine with people who want to do these great, grand things that Aristotle would not have called metaphysics, but they do. Go ahead, be my guest. But I'm really interested in making actual progress.
Hilary, you seem to want to say something.
Well, funny about that. So I enjoyed Patricia's rhetoric, but
I was told to be disruptive, but I'm finding it very easy.
I'm delighted. We'll have so much fun. So I think Patricia also has a grand story. She is making out that, oh, well, we just need to get down to the practical details. We can forget about these big grand pictures and so forth. But Patricia has a very big grand story. It's the modernist story that science is understanding what's really going on, that we only have to apply observation and reason, and that we will gradually uncover the truth about the universe. And I am alongside her in believing that we need to focus on observing how our models, or I would say closures about the world, function. And we should use reason to identify which ones have weaknesses and so forth. But I do not think we should stick to the grand metaphysical story that they are uncovering some essential character of the world, or could in principle uncover it. This idea we're making progress.
I never said such a thing. I don't know where you get this idea about me. I never said it. I've been a Feyerabendian since 1965, for God's sake.
Neurophysiology doesn't make us understand how the consciousness has the qualitative character that it has. But I wanted to say something to Hilary, because when I said we know what it is, I could be perverse and say, you're the one linking knowledge and language, because I don't think we could describe it. So I don't think we could theorize it. I was just talking about knowledge by acquaintance, that I want, and my slogan is, the having is the knowing. So I could come over and give you a kick right now, and would you like? And I would say that as I did it, you would have a certain experience and you would know what it was like just by having it. And that's all I mean. So it's, as it were, non-linguistic, non-propositional knowledge. It means something very basic. It's in that sense that we know exactly what consciousness is. You all have a certain visual field before you right now, and you know its qualitative character, but I don't think you could describe it. It would be incredibly hard. You just have it. So.
Okay.
Actually, what you say is really not true of the emotions, and it's not true of the of the various intestinal functions. That is, that people often fail to know that what they're feeling is fear or anger or frustration or joy. They don't actually recognize it.
Beauty is a very important guide in, well, mathematics and physics. I mean, I work in both these areas. If you want to know whether something is true or not, then your aesthetic judgment can be very important. It's not that it's a criterion for truth. I mean, it may be wrong or it may be right, and the criterion has to be in mathematics whether you can prove it or not, whether you can establish if it's true or not. But beauty is a guide. You can say, well, is it more likely to be true if I take this route? Well, I sometimes say, well, if it were true, would that be beautiful or would it not? But it's not a guide in the sense that you say it doesn't affect whether it's true or not. It doesn't affect, well, let's talk about physics, because that's a little different. Now, in physics, I think it is a guide, again, and I think, well, Dirac's comment is one of the most, I think the one I'm more familiar with is when somebody asked him how did he find his equation for the electron, and he said, when I found this, I knew I was right, because he said, I have a keen sense of the beautiful, and when I found this equation, I knew I was right. Well, you see, it's something about how things fit together, and you see this thing relates and brings out things that you didn't know before combined together, and you can see a sense of beauty comes about, and it gives it more credence. It's not a guide to whether it's right or not. Okay, that in physics it comes from the experiment. In mathematics it comes from whether you can prove it or not, whether it turns out to be true or not. But it's a guide, and I think I would always call it a guide and not necessarily, well, there is something deeper than that, because why is it a guide, you might say? Why is it more likely to be right or not? And I think I would find it very troublesome if we found that or one theory of physics which works incredibly well at a deep level is hideously ugly. I would say that one of the things about string theory, for instance, I mean, one might say, and I think Sabine has said this, that the trouble with it is that people say it's a beautiful theory, and that's what guided people into, kept people in this subject. It's true that it kept people in the subject because it had an effect on mathematics, which beautiful results came out of mathematics. But as a physical theory, I always regard it as hideous. It's not beautiful at all. The mathematics involved is elegant in many places. But when you think of it as a physical theory, you're combining the thing, you've got these extra dimensions, some of them are tiny, some of them are huge. Sometimes you get different numbers of dimensions mixed up together in the same theory. And it doesn't hang together as a physical scheme. There is something very strange about how things which are successful in mathematics and physics, I think they are beautiful. And that it's not just that we pick out the things that are more beautiful and therefore they're more successful, or that, clever people like to work with things that are beautiful and therefore they're more successful. It's not just things of that nature. I think there is something else which is important. And that in theories in physics which turn out to be correct, there is something. Well, what is it? I mean, is it just that they apply very broadly to different things and that, in a sense, is beautiful in itself, or is there something else in it? And I think there is. It's a bit hard to put one's finger on it. I certainly don't go along with Herman Weil is supposed to have made some comment about, when beauty and truth come into conflict, he would choose beauty every time. I mean, it's more kind of an emotional thing that you. Also, partly the beauty comes up later. You don't notice it's beautiful. I mean, the theory looks ugly at first because you don't see all the connections, you don't see the right way to phrase it. And then when you put it together and suddenly it seems that the beauty of it is revealed. Now, I'm saying there is some hidden beauty in these things which can reveal itself only when you see it at a deeper level. Now, is this just us being something... Okay, we feel happier when we understand things better.
I'm afraid I think the sublime is completely dead. There's a couple of amazing composers. Max Richter, if anyone's heard of him, wonderful composers that take you there. But I have to say, you know, we were all asked actually to watch the WAP video, and we were asked also to look at this art by a Japanese artist by Murakami. And I don't know if any of you have seen this WAP video, but actually I watched it. It was very interesting. I was thanking whoever decided we should watch it, because this is my first introduction to modern culture. And, and actually I found myself singing sort of along. There are whores in the house. There's some whores in the house. It was a good song, and actually I think if art is an expression of a culture, it absolutely, in fact, both of them absolutely express our own culture. I mean, you know, what are our obsessions? Sex and shopping. Murakami looked like he'd designed a shower curtain for kids for Tesco. You know, this is what we do.
How do you fit Rupert, perhaps you could square the idea that it's dead. I mean, are we not going a bit too far if we say that the sublime is dead in the modern world? Are we really that stuffed?
Well, I'm afraid I didn't do my homework. And,
you got a different kind of pussy.
And yes, I'm afraid I haven't actually seen the WAP video yet. Obviously, I'll have to watch it when I get home. But so I don't have an opinion about it.